Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and I just learned about a really cool tool called Mitosis, as you can kind of see on my screen. But what is Mitosis? And this just comes down to where a lot of things have kind of come from. So basically you have like the three big front-end frameworks: Angular, Vue, React. And different development teams build different applications using these three frameworks for their front end. The problem becomes what happens if you're a bigger company and you have like different applications that your company uses for different things, and different teams have different tech leads, and different tech leads prefer Angular, Vue, React, etc. So then what happens is you have one team working in React, one team working in Angular, one team working in Vue, but you want to create like consistency among like the user experience. So certain components of the UI have to be like rebuilt over and over again for every framework. Which results in this sort of like redundant way of doing things. The hope was that web components would sort of fix this problem, because then you don't need to remake, you just make it in web components. And web components, since they're a browser API, so they can be used regardless of what else you have going on, that would be something that you can kind of use from framework to framework. And to an extent that's true. Like, you can easily incorporate web components into like an Angular or Vue project for the most part. But when you get to something like React, React's workflow is a little bit different in sort of like the way it interacts with the UI, so it makes it kind of hard for the web component workflow to kind of meld very well with it. And someone created, like Ionic created the tool Stencil Js to allow you to create web components in a much easier way than just creating like raw web components using classes and all that stuff. And Stencil allows you to create code that looks a lot like React that turns into a web component. And then the idea is that you'd use it in whatever framework you want. But as I just mentioned, some frameworks work better with web components than others. So Mitosis' approach is kind of similar, where it's trying to create something where you can build something for everybody. So if you need something for Angular, you need something for Vue, you need something for React, you write the code and then it compiles. The difference is, instead of trying to compile to some sort of universal format like a web component, although it can compile to web components. I just realized I'm like talking into the wrong camera. But it can compile to web components. It allows you to compile to many targets. So instead of trying to force a web component to work in React, you just compile a React component, or you just compile an Angular component, and you can just use it in that frame in that framework. And on top of it, allows you to like create components for like Swift for like mobile apps, React Native for like mobile apps. And what's really exciting about this is that it uses this syntax called JS Lite, which is kind of like, it borrowed the concepts from like Solid JS and the way Solid JS uses syntax. So this compiles very much like Svelte and Solid, where basically you're not using a framework. It compiles down to normal JavaScript, or actually it compiles down to whatever your target is. So it could compile to React, to Vue, to Angular, whatever your target is. It compiles it, and then at the end, all you have is that thing. You don't have the JSX Lite anymore. JSX Lite works a little bit differently than your normal JSX, as far as like things are just a little bit simpler. And a lot of like the more React-y type complexities are not there. Okay. So looking at its documentation, like you can see, like it looks like a React component. You know, you import stuff. You export a function that returns JSX. The only difference is I'll take a look at the way state is used. See, it declares a variable called state, but notice, look, no set state. And we still use a useState function, but we're only passing it an object, and then it gives us back the state. Instead, what happens, I have a feeling that they're using probably like a proxy object under the hood, because that would totally make sense considering the way this is. And if you didn't see my video on proxy objects, check that out. It's a pretty cool JavaScript feature. But essentially what happens is, you see like when I update, so in this case here, where's the button that changes? So you see here like add list item. What does it do? All it does is just say, hey, this particular value in the state equals this value. And that's it. And that's going to trigger a re-render of the UI, which makes a lot of sense. Again, that they're probably using a proxy object, because that's how a proxy object works. You just create an object that runs additional logic anytime you reassign any of its properties. So that all makes sense to me. And then once you create the file, and the idea here is you just create like a single file, and then you use the CLI to compile the file. Okay. Now, if I wanted to work on this in a visual way, because like there really isn't like a dev server, kind of like how you can do like npm start in React. What you do is you use this tool called like the JSX Lite fiddle, which basically, again, here you can say here this is what your target output is. Okay, I'll show you exactly what it looks like in that output. So see, this is the JSX Lite code for Mitosis, and then you say, hey, I want to compose it. You know, I want to compile it into solid code. I want to compile it to web component code, and you can do that. And the cool thing here is that doing it here is I can write the code here and I can see what the ending component looks like over here. Okay, and then there's actually some like things I can just like add to it. So I think I can just like be like columns. Just let me add a column. Okay. Okay. Not quite sure what all these different things do, per se. Like you can build templates, and I'll explain why that's important when I talk more about this builder thing. But that's pretty cool. So the idea is like, again, instead of trying to compile to a universal, instead of having like one set of a universal code compiled to a universal format, you have a universal type of code that compiles to all formats. And basically the way it works is that actually it's taking this code. So when you have React has like a JSX transform. It's this Babel plugin that converts it into all these function calls to a function in React called createElement. And that's basically what's happening technically. If you were to console log a React component in your JavaScript, you'll see that it's like this object that's like this React element object. Okay. What this is doing, and I think this is the way Solid works too, is that it's compiling it not to some different JavaScript, it's compiling it to JSON. So it's creating like this JSON tree of the components and their state and all this stuff. And then basically that JSON just gets translated to the equivalent code. So it's not really taking this code and turning it to that. It's taking this code, turning it to JSON, and the JSON is being turned into the target. Now the beauty of that is, that means you could change, all you need to do, all that matters is the JSON. So you could, and so as you can see here, there's two different ways to do this. This is like JSX type way of doing it with Mitosis, but you could also use another syntax called Liquid Lite. Okay, and Liquid, if you're not familiar with Liquid, it's a templating language used for like Shopify. So I could also write it in Liquid Lite. Okay, and you could write the same exact component, and it's going to get compiled down to the same exact JSON. So on the other end, when it gets serialized into one of these compilation targets, it'll get compiled to the same code. So you could actually create, so what it does, it creates a universal in-between format, this JSON format. And literally you could create any kind of language that compiles to that JSON format and any sort of target that can compile from that format. And that's really cool. And because of that, the people who made Mitosis have a tool called builder.io. And this is like a headless CMS. Okay, which you can, or a CMS, depending how you want to use it. Okay, but the idea is you can create visual websites. Like you can actually say here, like drag and drop, build a website, and it's actually a React website, or it's actually an Angular website or a Vue website based on like, do you want the underlying code to you choose your framework. You just sit there and say, hey, what framework do I want to have my website built in? You build it using a visual designer, because that visual designer just renders it into that JSON format, which can then be compiled to wherever. Okay, so again, the big thing here is that JSON format, which is, you know, like really clever. And then on top of that, there's a plugin from Figma that uses the same technology, where you can take your like Figma designs, and your Figma designs can just be turned into the actual website, because they'll be turned into that JSON format and then compiled down to whatever framework you choose. So you can actually just focus on designing a website in Figma and then have that website now as code. So this is pretty interesting and fascinating technology. Keep an eye out on the LogRocket blog. I do have an article where I'll go more in depth with this coming in the upcoming weeks. If you don't read the LogRocket blog, you should. and I try to contribute every once in a while. Good times. But yeah, so this is cool. I find this to be quite interesting. You know, and yeah, really take a look. I'll put the links in the video description, but this is a cool piece of technology. Okay, so y'all, again, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join the Slack and Discord community over there at devnursery.com. Ciao.